From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carolyn Brown. I direct the Office of Scholarly Programs in the John W. Kluge Center here at the library, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this afternoon for what I know is going to be a very interesting presentation by Professor Jennifer Hochschild, who is currently the Kluge Chair in American Law and Governance here at the Kluge Center, and she will be speaking about the political implications of human genomics. Before we begin, let me remind you to please turn off your cell phones and any other electronic equipment that can go off and disturb the speaker, the audience, or the recording. The event is sponsored by the John W. Kluge Center, which was established through a very generous endowment of John W. Kluge to create a scholarly venue on Capitol Hill where the nation's leaders would have at least the opportunity to tap into the mature wisdom of scholars, senior scholars, and use in some way their judgment and knowledge to bring fresh perspectives to government. The vision was for a center that would provide a space, as the founding document said, where the world of affairs and the world of ideas could meet, where the thinkers and doers could come together for a mutually enriching conversation. These highly accomplished scholars would be part of a community that would include the most promising rising generation of junior scholars, and all would come together to draw on the collections of the library and the library's wonderful curators and form a rich intellectual community. The center also promotes lectures such as this one, small conferences, symposia. If you're interested in knowing more, you can sign up for email notification. Go to the front page of the Library of Congress, right-hand side, click onto Kluge Center, and then at the bottom of the Kluge webpage, you'll be able to sign up for notifications. Today's speaker, Jennifer Hochschild, has been in residence at the Kluge Center for 6 months, actually. It's gone very fast. She's been very diligent, but I realize I haven't had much time to talk to her because she's been busy and I've been busy. But I hope it's been a very productive 6 months. She'll be returning to Harvard University, where she is the Henry LaBarre Jayne Professor of Government and a professor of African and African American Studies. She works on the intersection of American politics and political philosophy, particularly in the areas of race, ethnicity, immigration, and education policy. Issues related to public opinion and political culture are also part of her concern. To give you a more sort of solid sense of what she's been up to, I'm just going to mention a few of the books that she has co-authored or authored, and that'll give you a good sense. Co-authored The American Dream in the Public Schools, 2003, and is the author of Facing Up to the American Dream, Race, Class, and the Soul of the Nation, 1995. The American Dilemma, Liberal Democracy and School Desegregation, from 1984. What's Fair? American Beliefs and Distributive Justice, 1981. Needless to say, this is a small selection of the books, and I didn't mention any of her numerous other publications. She's also the founding editor of Perspectives on Politics, which is published by the American Political Science Association, and is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I'm not going to go and list all the fellowships and other accomplishments because you really didn't come for that part. You came to hear what she has to say, which is also what I want to hear, as that is. The Human Genome Project, which I think you all know, is an international effort to understand the genetic makeup of the human species. We read about it in the newspaper all the time. It is driven, of course, by the unquenchable human unquenchable, human impulse to understand the world, and also our own physiology, but also by the potential importance for developing medicine and important other health interventions. As a species, however, human race has a rather sad record of using wonderful innovations in all sorts of ways that are less than wonderful. As a political scientist, Dr. Hochschild is interested, therefore, in what we're going to do with this amazing genomic knowledge, what are its public policy implications, and then the really hard question of who decides what we're going to do as a society. So the social implications of the issues raised by these scientific advances are very important, and so far mostly haven't gotten into the mainstream in the areas of great controversy. But I think today we're going to hear about some of the implications of the human genomics, as well as maybe a glance into the future as to what we might expect as the public and the Congress and others grow increasingly aware of the implications. So please welcome Jennifer Hochschild.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you all for coming. It's a hot, muggy day. We should all be out at the beach, but I'm delighted that you're not. First thing I want to say is just thanks to the Kluge Center, to the Library of Congress, to the staff, to Carolyn, to my colleagues. It's been an absolutely fabulous 6 months. My office is now completely bare, and I'm going home day after tomorrow with considerable regret. It's just been a wonderful time, so thank you very much. This is one of the first times I've been talking. This is a new project. It grows out of my work on racial and ethnic politics, public policy, political philosophy, American political beliefs over the last now 20 or 30 years. At the beginning of my last 6 months, of this past 6 months, I finished a book project that I've been working on for close to a decade, and I was delighted to turn my attention to a new one, which grows out of that material, but is really moving in quite a different direction. First thing I should say is that the Maya Sen here is my co-author, so when I say we, it's not a royal we, there's a real we. She's a PhD student in the government department at Harvard. She has a law degree, so one of the directions we're going with this project is looking at the forensic stuff. And she has done most, or not, or maybe perhaps all of the data analysis. So when I talk about the data themselves, I'm mostly mouthing Maya's analyses. So if you ask me hard questions, I'll just say, wait till she's down in Washington. So the project is looking, as Carolyn said, at the politics and policies that are going to develop out of this relatively new field called genomic science. I'll explain in a minute or so what I mean by that, but just to kind of motivate your interest, which is in part what motivated mine. This is a paragraph that is in The Economist, and as you all know, The Economist is a sort of a, on the one hand, on the other hand, doesn't really go far out in a limb, with the possible exception of support for free markets. So when I read this paragraph, I was fairly struck by it. I had begun working on the project, but hadn't really thought through how important I think it actually is. But 4 or 5 years ago, The Economist wrote, "There is in biology a sense of barely contained expectations reminiscent of the physical sciences at the turn of the 20th century." Well, you think about what physics did in the 20th century. It transformed the world. It's a feeling of advancing into the unknown. That's what biology is now doing for us. Where this advance will lead is both exciting and mysterious. Again, returns to the analogy with 20th century physics, and it will continue for both good and ill. And both the analogy itself and the importance of physics to the 20th century, transforming how we travel, how we understand the universe, also allowing us to create nuclear destruction and so on. If biology is going to do that in the 21st century, then political scientists, of which I am, need to pay attention to it. So does the public as a whole, of course. And so what I'm trying to do is bring the politics and policies issues that are just beginning to come into the sort of the public horizon, try to bring some focus to them. What is genomics? Well, the first, most straightforward definition, this is from dictionary.com or something like that, it's simply the study of genetics that studies the full DNA sequence rather than gene by gene or DNA segment by DNA segment. So it's all rather than part. That's the simplest explanation. A slightly more philosophical explanation of what it means to think about the whole genetic composition of the human body or any other cellular organism, is that it's a systemic phenomenon that can't be reduced to sort of counting up genes and the spaces in DNA that are not themselves genes. There are so many interactions, so many contingencies, so much complexity to the composition of the whole genome that it's involved, quote, in governance of whole novel forms of information. So that takes us kind of one level of philosophical discourse beyond counting genes. A third definition, or a third understanding, comes from one of the interviews that I've been conducting over the past couple of months. This is from a scientist who is a very fine biologist, but has a much more sort of mystical understanding of what this whole phenomenon is. It's pushing us to new stages of understanding our identity. The genome as an entity, as a thing, is pushing us, so it's an active force. Parts of the genome are designed to push us into larger life, stimulating another stage of human development. And this interview subject went on for quite a long time explaining what this sort of much more elaborated philosophy means. I won't go there because I'm not a philosopher, nor am I, for that matter, a real biologist. But here's a more sort of practical or pragmatic or sort of minute-to-minute understanding of what genomics can do for us. Genetically engineered food, which is a big political issue in some places, actually less politically contentious than I would expect it to be, but it's out there. Certainly the ability to identify the genes for rare and devastating diseases, that's been around for a while before genomics became a visible science, but it's been orders of magnitude made more, it's order of magnitude faster and better as a consequence of moving from gene by gene to the genomic whole. Thinking about the environmental interactions with the genes for most diseases, of course, we know that the old nature versus nurture logic simply no longer obtains. Genes are turned on or off, or genetic impact is largely a consequence of environment. It also turns out that the environment can transform the genome, so the causal direction goes both ways, including for inheritance from as yet unborn or even unconceived children. So there's a very complicated environmental interaction. Identify victims of massacres, identify, of course, whether the person claimed to have been Osama bin Laden was in fact him. You can identify Dogg or any other kind of waste through genomics, which some cities are beginning to do. You can determine whether someone who is, whether King Louis the 17th, really was the son of Queen Marie Antoinette. So you can trace lineages not only from living people, but also from people, of course, long in the past. You can tell whether the fish in your sushi really is salmon. You can use it in the forensic arena for determination of rape victims or rape committers. And, of course, it can be used for exoneration. I'll talk about the criminal justice system in a minute. There's also dating services, matchmaking cruise ships, which people are suggesting. If you send in your DNA swab, we'll match you with someone whose genome matches yours, or maybe someone whose genome's opposite from yours, whatever that means, depending on what you want. This is my favorite use of genomics. This is you send in a cheek swab and you get your own personalized poster from this company, and it's in various sizes and various color combinations. If you go to the website, you can choose whatever color, and I've actually talked with these people. They're quite interesting, and they're going to be on my list of people to interview. Their mission, they say, is not making money, which is, of course, you pay for this little poster, but they're trying to demystify genomics and bring it into the public arena in a way that people will understand the magic and beauty of the science. So, buy yourself a poster. So our project, more seriously, is looking, as I said, at the genomics, politics, policy intersection. And we start from the presumption that as citizens in the United States, but also elsewhere, there's a small comparative component to this project, and there's going to be much more as it develops, but I'm still trying to get my hands around the American context. As people learn more about it, see more of its impact in their daily lives and in larger sort of scientific endeavors, it will develop partisan and ideological casts. That's the sort of the underlying hypothesis. The analogy, for example, is placental stem cell research, which nobody had any idea what that phrase meant, and then suddenly it came into the public arena, and about 24 hours later, it got very tightly attached to abortion politics. So people who were, roughly speaking, pro-choice tended to support research in placental stem cells. People who were pro-life tended to oppose it. Now, it's not a one-for-one relationship. There are famous people on both sides. But it became politically attached very, very quickly. Global warming or climate change, of course, has done the same thing. There's nothing inherent in the science of carbon dioxide use that would be a Republican or Democratic position, but it has become politicized. So our starting hypothesis is that genomics, which hasn't yet developed those kind of valences, will. Policy disputes will move out of the scientific community into the public arena. That's part of the politicization. And so today what I want to talk about is what Americans know and think about genomics, and particularly its relationship to race or ethnicity. Not so much because I think there is a strong politics around this, there isn't, but because I think there's going to be, and it's important, or at least it's plausible that there's going to be, and it's important that we have a sense of kind of where people are now so that we can trace the development of this politics. From a theoretical perspective as a political scientist, I'm interested in tracking how a politics gets created where there isn't one. So I'm going to talk about two arenas of work that we're working on. One is the DNA ancestry testing. You send in a cheek swab and you don't get a poster, but you get a statement of what your ancestors, where they're from. I'll talk about that a little more extensively. And that's really a political issue. It's not a policy issue, or at least it isn't yet. And then, of course, there's a very important policy issue of using DNA data banks in the criminal justice system. So I'm going to talk about those two pieces of the research project to try to give you a feel for what the enterprise is about. So what is a race, if we think about it from the perspective of genomics? Well, the first wave, roughly the first decade or so, when the Human Genome Project was being developed, and at least in the initial stages, and many people will continue to argue what these two quotations are saying, is that genomics has proven definitively that there is no such thing as a race. J. Craig Venter says, what we've shown is that the concept of race has no scientific basis. Cavalli Forza and his co-authors, who wrote earlier during the beginnings of the Genome Project, explain why Venter can make that claim. Classification into races is a futile exercise. We can identify clusters of populations through genomic science, but at no level can any cluster be identified with what we understand to be a race. Since every level of clusters produces a different partition, there's no biological reason to prefer one or the other. So you can ask the computer to sort of take a sample, a genomic sample, and give me 5 different divisions. And they turn out to look a lot like black, white, Asian, Latino, Native American. You can ask the computer to give you 17 divisions. And they turn out to be a coherent set of locations that we can attach labels to. You ask the computer to give you 27, and it'll do it, 72, whatever. There's no scientific reason to choose 1, 5, 7, 17 any more than any other. So there was nothing biological about the language of race. That's what these people are saying. However, subsequently, the argument got a little bit more complicated, maybe a little more subtle, but at least a little more complicated. Things that we think of as conventional races, the sort of Blumenbachian 5 categories that we normally use, sort of black, white, yellow, red, and brown, to put it in its most crude language, turn out to have patterned differences in the 1/10 of 1% of the human genome that differs across populations. It's a tiny fraction of the human genome. It's 3 million base pairs. So there are 3 million possibilities for clusters that have something that look a lot like what we tend to think of when we talk about races. So there's varied susceptibility to some diseases. You can identify, the beginning to be able to identify phenotypes, skin color, eye color, hair patterning, and so on. So the scientists that I've been talking to, and the quotation that I have here, are no longer quite willing to say there's nothing going on in the arena of what we conventionally call race. They don't want to use the term correctly. It's not sort of simple and straightforward. But as this researcher says, how distinct are these categories? They're not distinct at all. Race is a complex construct, social factors, self-identity, third-party factors of identification, but it also includes biological factors. And the scientists working in this arena will consistently say that. You know, we know the history of eugenics. We get the idea that race is a social construction. We know that. Nevertheless, they will say over and over, there's something biological going on here which we can't just ignore because we know what consequences it's had in the historical past. And probably one of the underlying issues for me for this whole project is how do we think about that? Is there a way of talking about race, all scare quotes all the time, and biology that doesn't just throw us back into the old racial science of the 19th and 20th century. The genomic scientists say we have to figure out how to do that, we as a society as well as we as individuals and authors, writers, speakers, researchers. So that's the big question for the project. The small piece of it that I'm working on today, as I say, is ancestry testing in forensic science. I won't go into the details of how to do the ancestry testing. There are several different kinds of tests, partly depending on which you choose, depending on how much money you spend, depending on your own sex, and so on. But basically, for our purposes, it can do two different kinds of things. It can show blurred or mixed ancestry. So you're 27% Asian and 32% European and 48% African and whatever's left over to get you up to 100% Native American or something like that. So lots of people, of course, have very mixed ancestry, and the ancestry test will show that. A second thing the ancestry tests can do, if my screen will come up, is what we're calling reify a single ancestry. And it can do that in two different ways. One, it can say, actually, you are purebred, pure blood, something or other from whatever continent. So you're 97% Asian, you're 100% European, you're a full-blooded African, you're something like that. The test, I mean, the language is mine, but the test results can show that kind of single continental ancestry. Or a different kind of test which focuses much more on a particular ancestral line, not your whole ancestral background, but a particular line, purports to be able to say you are a descendant of what is now the something or other tribe in a particular geographic location. You are a descendant of what is now understood to be the Zulu or the Mende or the Celts or the Jewish Kohanim or something like that. These are different kinds of tests. It's not worth going into the details of why they produce, but the basic point here is that you can either produce a blurred or mixed result, or you can produce a quite focused, racially pure or tribally based or group-based result. So the question for us is, how much does any of this have to do with a person's racial identity? Why do we care? Well, because there's very different emotional connotations and very different political implications. And again, I'm just going to use a few quotes to suggest the flavor of the way in which this could be politicized or could feel important to the individual themselves. Blurring, this is the 42% this and 37% that category. Jack Hitt, this is written in, as it comes from the Atlantic, he describes himself as being red-haired, freckled, and having Scottish ancestry. Turns out, he says, I carry the DNA marker from the Fulbe tribe in contemporary Nigeria, and he claims that he's now actually much more interested in African politics, Nigerian history, economy, society, because he feels an affinity, he feels an association. So that's the sort of the blurring mixture, it's a small world after all sort of logic, right? There's an opposite kind of positive valence from these ancestry tests. This is from University of Chicago Alumni Magazine. The Reverend Al Simpson says, 500 years ago, my DNA was removed from Sierra Leone. He was, of course, his ancestors were part of the Middle Passage. Taken to America, I'm coming back from my seat. My seat has been vacant. He asked for a Temne name to reclaim what was taken away from him. So it's a very deep emotional attachment to a very particular location and a very particular ancestral line. So the reification logic has a very different feel than the blurring logic. How about the politics of this? Well, this is my favorite. If I had time, I was going to pull up the YouTube video, but you should all go look at it. Snoop Dogg's DNA ancestry testing was done on the George Lopez show, and he finds out that he's got 75% African. No, he's got more European ancestry than Charles Barkley, who'd been done earlier. He says, we got to have a revote. This ain't right. And he's clearly very unhappy. Now, he's joking, but he's not very happy about it. And Barkley says, well, I'll just call you Whitey from now on. And Barkley pulls out a bunch of presents. He gives him a tennis racket, and he gives him a pink scarf, and he gives him a whole bunch of things that are sort of Whitey, presents for Whitey, right? So it's funny, it's a joke, but there's an edge to it. They're not altogether happy about this. On the other hand, so that's the sort of the blurring can be not so positive. The other side of it, this is from a professor at Penn. He says, when people discover, I thought I was black, but I'm also Asian and white, again, the small world logic, they have different conversations, they're less bigoted, they ask deeper questions, they're more open to difference. So that's the positive kind of politics of blurring. What about reification? Again, there's a negative politics to it. Troy Duster, a sociologist, says the use of markers for individual identification, the I am a descendant of this particular tribe, I am 97% this particular ancestry, it'll be subtly, inadvertently reinscribe race at the molecular level. So he's worrying that what we understand to be a social construction is going to be turned one more time into a biological reality with all kinds of harmful consequences. We've seen that in history over and over, says Duster. We're going to see it again if we're going to go in this reification direction. My colleague, Henry Louis Gates, is much more positive. He also runs one of these companies, perhaps not coincidentally. For the first time since the 17th century, we can symbolically reverse the Middle Passage. Think back to the Reverend Simpson I was describing a minute ago. Our ancestors brought something that not even the slave trade could take away, their own distinctive DNA. A match reveals a shared ethnic ancestry that has been lost for centuries. So he's in some sense celebrating the biologization of race, at least in this very particular historical understanding of what that means. So again, there can be a positive and negative politics of the blurring. There can be a positive, negative politics of reification. All right, so we took all of these background and we ran a survey experiment in which we basically did something about it. We ran it through knowledge networks. We used about 1,000 samples done about a year ago. We selected people on the basis of their race ethnicity, so black, white, Asian, Latino, self-defined multiracial are our 5 groups. I know those are not the same thing, and we can talk about why they're not the same thing later if you want, but for the moment, allow me to assert that they're sort of parallel constructions, right? And we gave them vignettes. Since most people hadn't, in fact, done these tests and didn't really know much about them, we had to explain what was going on and ask them to put themselves in the position. So we gave them the name of a person who was the same gender as them, Isabella or Michael, I think we used, or David. It's a woman who identifies as whatever your race is. So we matched the vignette person by race and gender to the person responding to the survey. She's taken a DNA test, and then we gave them 2 alternatives. It could be traced primarily to a particular continent, i.e. the reification logic, or her ancestry is blurred across a bunch of different continents. So we basically gave people the reification and blurring vignettes. We provided them with a little map that would light up on what we were showing them, either a particular continent or the world as a whole. Turns out this map actually was quite difficult. Maya and I went through a lot of discussion. What do you do with Australia? What do you do with the Caribbean? What do you do with Brazil? She was insisting that the Middle East belongs as part of Asia. It's not part of Europe. We went to the census document. It turns out that depending on which census you use, the Middle East migrates back and forth between Asia and Europe. It's not so easy to do this very simple map, but we did it in any case. So we asked them, so we gave them the vignette and we asked them 3 questions. How would you feel if you were this person? And we were hoping they would identify with the person. Would you be pleased? Would you find it believable? And would it matter to your identity? So how pleased are people? Well, people who define themselves as being multiracial are pleased to be associated with more than one continent, and that seems fairly self-evident. So, I mean, I'm glad of that result, because if we didn't have that, then I'd be quite nervous about the vignette. But basically, it's not terribly exciting. A more interesting result, blacks are pleased disproportionately more than any other group to be associated with Africa in particular, the reification result associated with Africa. Whites are least pleased to be associated with only one continent, i.e. Europe. So we have a complete reversal here of the traditional American one drop of blood rule. Blacks want to be associated with a single continent, single ancestral lineage of Africa. Whites, what perhaps the most surprising, at least if you think about 20th century history, don't want to be associated with a single continent of Europe. Now, do we really believe this, or are they understanding what the politically correct answer is? Who knows? But the reported results are the reverse of what the last 150 years or so of American history spent a lot of time and effort and law and death to try to create. It's a very interesting result. And most of the groups prefer the reification rather than blurring. They prefer to be associated with a particular ancestry, a particular continental ancestry, rather than the small world sort of we're all brothers under the skin kind of logic. Do they believe these results? If you were Isabella or David, would you believe these results? The answer, roughly speaking, is yes. They find the science, no, the scientists don't find this ancestral science very persuasive, but the survey respondents say, yeah, we believe it. Americans have a lot of confidence in science. They find the reifying results, however, more believable than the blurring results. So once again, they're more persuaded by, as well as being more pleased by, a single continental ancestry. And most of the other responses are neither, which is a sort of the default position. So most people believe the results, And to the degree that there's variation, they believe the more when it's focused on a single continent. What about the impact on your identity? Well, it turns out Black, African-American respondents are more affected by the results, regardless of whether they show reification or blurring. So the phenomenon of sort of wanting to know and believing the science about one's ancestry is just a more powerful phenomenon among the Black population. Now, again, maybe that's because they don't have paper genealogies. Maybe it's because the racial history is so complicated and so fraught. Maybe it's because they're answering the survey in some way or so on. But the test results show very clearly that the identity issues are much more important. They just matter more to the Black population, regardless of the results. Whites are least affected by these results, which is in some sense a symmetrical flip side of the same story. Maybe because whites don't care about their ancestry. They're confident that they came from the right continent. They can do genealogies. Whoever knows, whatever reason, whites are least interested. And close to half of the population, and a majority say, no, this wouldn't actually make any difference to me one way or the other. But a quarter to a half of the population say it actually would make a difference. Okay, so what are the conclusions? Blacks are most and whites are least pleased with sharp or reified or distinct continental boundaries. Most respondents trust the science. Blacks are most affected by the testing, whites are the least. So we've got something of, I think, a developing conflict between the genomic science, which says there is no such thing as race largely. There are population affinities or associations with particular diseases or particular phenotypes. But no genomic scientist will say there is such a thing as race, and they absolutely will resist anything that looks like a reification or a strong association with a single continent or a single location. But the population as a whole are all more engaged with reification. They're more interested in it. They're more persuaded by it. The possible exception here are self-defined multiracials, but that's more or less a circular result. They wouldn't be self-defined multiracials if they weren't already committed to the blurring logic. So the science seems to be going in a different direction from the popular interest and commitment and identity. If I had more time, we've got other results from a media analysis that show essentially the same thing, that the reification logic is a much more powerful logic in the public arena than the blurring logic, although every genomic scientist will tell you that blurring is the right way to understand race, not reification. So there's a potential conflict developing in the public arena as this moves into more visibility. Okay, second topic that I want to talk briefly about is this is more policy specific rather than politics. It has to do with the biobanks and law enforcement. Again, it's a complicated story which I will just very briefly give you 3 sentences. All states collect DNA from people convicted of felonies and do tests for markers in 13 different locations. All states also collect DNA from crime scenes. About half of the states, and an increasing number, this number of half is unstable, it'll be more in the next couple of years, collect DNA from arrestees, and in principle they're supposed to expunge it if the person is not convicted, but in practice they almost never do, as far as we can tell. Some of them collect DNA from deportable immigrants subject to deportation. 3 states permit the use of databanks for familial matches, which is to say you can use the DNA from the crime scene not only to search for a perfect match, which is what most states do, but also for a partial match, somebody who's 2/3, 3/4, 9/10 the same as the sample at the crime scene. You know it's not the criminal because it's not a perfect match, but it may well be a family member of the criminal. So you can track the family member who track the person who is a plausible family relation to the potential criminal and figure out what relations he, because it's almost always a he, has, where they were, go to the door and say, we know you didn't do this, but by the way, where was your cousin Johnny last Friday night? And so on. So the familial searches are a growing use of the DNA and expand the population potentially subject to forensic biobanks by a very large proportion. The FBI, some states also allow the collection of, quote, abandoned DNA. So if you smoke a cigarette, if you comb your hair, if you eat a piece of pizza, if you drink a cup of coffee, somebody can follow and retrieve that abandoned DNA. This is perfectly legal. And then collect the DNA sample from that. The FBI coordinates this at the national level. I'm going to go interview the FBI tomorrow. It took a lot of effort to get somebody to talk to me, but they claim they're going to. So how do people view about this? How do people feel about the use of DNA in the criminal justice system? So again, our project is looking at public views on the grounds that this is going to become more visible and more important over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Again, we're focusing on racial and ethnic variation. This is a different internet representative sample. It's got 4,200 respondents with the same US groups, the same groups. And we basically organize it not around reification and blurring, but around 3 fundamental principles, 3 theories of how these forensic biobanks might affect people of different races and ethnicities. One logic is racial harm, which is you start from the fact that Black and Latino men are very disproportionately overrepresented in these biobanks. There's now about 10 million samples, and probably half or more of them are Black or Latino. So they're more likely to be caught. Also, through the familial matching, it's much more likely that family members of Blacks and Latinos will be investigated not as potential criminals themselves, but as having a close family relationship to someone who might be a person of interest. So one calculation, this is now a calculation from 5 years ago when the biobanks were probably half the size that they are now. The calculation then was that roughly 20% of the Black population was available for familial investigation compared to roughly 4% of the white population. Somebody else has done a calculation for Latino families. Given Latino families are simply larger, there's a larger fraction of number of people in any given nuclear family. They're also even more disproportionately subject to familial matches, perhaps, than Black families, according to that argument. So group disparities will continue to rise as the databases grow. And some people describe this, for example, as building Jim Crow's database. It's sort of surveillance through DNA testing rather than surveillance through the more crude, old-fashioned measures. A second logic is that actually Black and Latino populations will benefit rather than be harmed. After all, if you think about the other uses of evidence in the criminal justice system, they actually may be more racially biased. Do we trust eyewitness reports? Do we trust police reports? Do we trust juries? Do we trust public defenders? Well, not all that much, according to the evidence. There's clear evidence of racial bias at a whole series of stages. Arguably, DNA biobanks are more trustworthy from the perspective of an African American or a Latino because race doesn't have any, because genes don't have any race. They might actually be a benefit rather than a harm. Black and Latino communities are under-policed as much as they're over-policed. Many of the, sort of the worst horrific forms of crime actually occur within African American Latino communities, so there might actually be a benefit to using the biobanks. And even the targeted searches through the familial matches, sort of the surveillance, might be preferable to kind of broad sweeps, bring in every young Black man between the ages of 15 and 25 and do a fingerprint. So it's arguable that these biobanks will benefit rather than harm African American communities. And a third logic, of course, is that they won't do one or the, they'll do neither one. As some of the, we asked for open-ended responses. We asked our survey respondents to tell us what they thought about these things. And one guy wrote, if I'm not guilty, it's not going to affect me. It doesn't matter what race I am. This is not about race. This is about guilt or innocence, period. Okay, what are the political valances? President Obama, in a TV interview, reminded the audience that he's the father of 2 young daughters. And it says he supports forensic DNA biobanks and supports federal funding to develop them at states and the federal government. It's so important to every family across America. There are too many horror stories. We're not doing enough. We insist on justice. So that's one logic. The opposite politics is the ACLU. Family searching is an imprecise tool. It will invade the privacy of a lot of people. Or even more starkly, you're going to see the majority of the African American population under genetic surveillance. If you do the math, that's where you end up. So there's a real political sharp edge to this question of DNA biobanks, and particularly the racial component of it. There should be implications of the 3 theories. If you look at the public opinion survey, which I'm about to do, Blacks and Latinos will be skeptical if they think these are going to cause racial harm. They'll be supportive if they think forensic biobanks are going to cause racial benefit. And they won't differ from whites, multiracials, Asians, if they think it's neutral. I'll go very quickly through the results just to give you a feel for them. Basically, almost all of the groups say essentially, roughly half of the people in almost all the groups say they know something or a lot about these biobanks. We defined the biobank in the survey and then said, have you ever heard or read about this thing? And everybody, roughly half the population say, sure, I know what this thing is. Do we believe them? I have no idea. But they didn't differ across race. Are they desirable? This is the more interesting results. Basically, close to 2/3 of the sample as a whole said, yes, they do more good than harm. Only 40% of blacks said they do more good than harm. Blacks are clearly skeptical of the good that biobanks are likely to do, and that holds up with controls. We asked people, would you be willing to contribute your own DNA sample to such a biobank? And about 60% say yes, they would be willing. It's a much higher number than I thought. I expected that to be much lower. But again, if you believe the survey, 60% said yes. Hispanics were actually more willing, and blacks considerably less willing. So again, there's a disparity between black skepticism and unwillingness to participate as compared with the rest of the population. Oops. Do you trust the government to oversee the use of them? Again, about 70% say, yeah, I trust the government, that it knows what it's doing. Blacks are much less likely to say that than all other populations. They're significantly more mistrustful. Do you trust private companies? Again, blacks are significantly more mistrustful than the rest of the population. Should the government fund more extensive use? And should the government regulate the use of biobanks more fully? No racial differences here. 80-something% of everybody said, yes, we should fund them more, and yes, we should regulate them more. Those aren't inconsistent responses, but they're a complicated politics, right? They don't divide neatly into sort of law and order at all costs versus regulate, caution, hold back. People want both. They want law and order, and they're willing to spend money for it, and they want a lot of regulation. And there's no racial differences there. In sum, there's little difference across the groups in knowledge of biobanks, support for funding, or support for regulation. High support for funding and regulation, same amount of claimed knowledge. But blacks are much more likely than whites especially to see harm to society as a consequence of using forensic biobanks. They're much less willing to contribute their own DNA. They mistrust government officials much more than whites do. And they mistrust private companies much more. There's a broad pattern of just mistrust of this new technology. Asians and Hispanics are more or less in between, which turns out to be the result in any survey that you do on any subject at all. They're more positive than blacks and less positive than whites. And multiracials turn out to be very similar to whites. So the big gap is between the black population and everybody else, roughly speaking, although it's more of a continuum. It's not an absolute sharp divide. So this is my final slide, I promise you. What are the big issues that are going to be emerging politically and in policy terms around these two topics? Will genomics have any impact on American racial identity? It might simply be irrelevant, that the history and the practice and the culture and the identity issues are just so powerful that genomics is just going to be an odd little blip that 3 people in the world, 2 of whom are myself and my co-author, study. It could dissolve American racial identity if lots of people do ancestry testing and discover that they have, in fact, a greatly mixed racial ancestry and they take it seriously. Or it could reify group boundaries. The scientists say it ought to dissolve racial boundaries. It shows that there is no science of race in any very meaningful way. The public opinion surveys and the media analyses we do show the opposite, that sort of racial boundaries are getting reified, sharpened, intensified, rather than blurred. Will genomics bring biology back into race? Again, the genomic scientists will tell you that that's a false association. There is no race in biology, there's no biology in race. But they'll also tell you that you can't simply assert that race is a social construction. The easy kind of social scientist, anthropologist answer that says there's no biology here anywhere, that's equally wrong. That we've got to figure out how to talk about the relationship between biology and race. Will it, in fact, as we embark on that conversation over the next couple of decades, will it be just harmful? Will it bring back eugenics, racial science, measuring skull size and all that stuff from the 19th century? Is it inevitable, which is what the scientists will tell us? Or could it actually be medically helpful? Again, the genomic scientists are very excited about the possibility of finding population clusters through genome-wide association studies and various, because it gives them body of material to work on finding the genetic pathways for particular horrible diseases. They think if they've got a handle on populations that have these genetic mutations, they'll be much further ahead in kind of doing the science. So they actually want to find, they're actually in some senses pleased when they find a population association because it allows them to advance their science much further and benefit that population. Third big question, maybe. So what's the impact going to be of forensic biobanks on the criminal justice system? Again, will it be irrelevant? These things are expensive. They're politically controversial. The science isn't that good yet. Police departments don't know how to use it. It may not matter. I think it doesn't matter a whole lot now. I think it's likely to matter more in the future. Is it going to harm racial and ethnic minorities, in particular the black population? That's what the public opinion data are saying. Is it going to benefit racial and ethnic minorities? That's what the people working on forensic biobanks, perhaps not surprisingly, are saying. There's a whole area, which I haven't talked about exoneration, using DNA to actually release people who were falsely convicted of felonies, who are overwhelmingly, disproportionately young, male, black, Latino, and poor. So forensic biobanks might actually have a beneficial as well as a harmful or instead of a harmful effect. And finally, what about public support for the criminal justice system or people's belief in the legitimacy and validity of the criminal justice process? Will DNA biobanks increase black mistrust? That's what the data are showing us so far. Will they offset black mistrust to the degree that people believe the science and they find the science actually more trustworthy than the politics and the policing that we now have? Will people increasingly come to endorse the use of DNA for exoneration rather than for conviction, which stands the whole logic on its head? The Innocence Project not only supports the idea of using DNA, it's seeking a national right for every convicted felon to have his or her DNA tested for purposes of pursuing exoneration. So there's a totally flip side possibility to the one I've been talking about so far. Conclusion, the old Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times, and I believe we do. And there's a long list of people I want to thank, especially the Kluge Center. Thank you. That was a long talk. Of course. Comments and questions? Yes. Why I want to polarize the issue? I don't.
I'm not sure if that's the route that you may or may not want to take in this.
Yeah, fair enough. I don't know if everybody was able to hear before she had the microphone. The question is, why do I want to polarize? I said at the beginning that I'm trying to understand the partisan and ideological cast. And I may not have used the word understand. I can't remember what verb I used. But the question is, do I think it's a good thing for this to become polarized or ideologically sharp? Is that fair? No, I don't think it's a particularly good idea. It seems to me that, if you think about stem cell research or you think about climate change, the political polarization has been harmful to the science and harmful to the public in general on both of those. What I do think is, so this isn't so much a normative claim that we ought to go in the direction of partisanship or ideology. It's more of an empirical prediction that it's hard for me to believe that we won't, we as a society. I think, or at least I think my co-author and I think, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was willing to support us to think, it's going to happen. It's very difficult for anything that's as important as physics was to the 20th century, that has billions of dollars of investment, that has huge industries, that has implications, again, ranging from your sushi to your conviction to the cure for your cancer. I mean, it's going to be political, just because it's too damned important not to be. So our goal is to understand the early stages of how that politics might get played out, rather than to endorse or support or promote it. Yes, sir.
You used the phrase in your orally that Americans have a lot of confidence in science, and one of your view graphs said they have a lot of confidence in DNA science. Could you say a few words about what you think that phrase means?
I'm sorry, repeat the phrase, I just didn't hear.
You said Americans have a lot of confidence in science, and one of your view graphs has said Americans have a lot of confidence in DNA science. I was wondering if you could say a few words about what you think it means when you say Americans have confidence in science.
Yeah, fair enough. Yes, it's a loaded question. Well, what I was thinking about was a somewhat superficial response, which is to say, if you look at public opinion surveys and you say, how much confidence do you have in the following 10 things, science always comes out at the top. So compared with, this is an easy one, compared with Congress, compared with the presidency, compared with banks, compared with newspapers, reporters, compared with insurance salesmen, it comes out way high. But it also comes out very high with a slightly more serious competition, compared with the military, compared with sort of major industry. Every survey that I've ever looked at, science in the military actually come out at the top of that set of comparisons. Not just by comparison, but also 70, 80% of the population say they have a lot of confidence in science or scientists. What does that mean? It means as much as we think any public opinion survey means. If you ask people about, for example, do they believe in scientific literacy? Do they think children ought to be required to take science courses? Do they wish they knew more science themselves? Do they think scientists are engaged in important endeavors? I mean, a more robust set of questions. Again, you get very strong positive support. It gets more complicated in the public arena, which is, of course, what you're referring to. There's a religion versus science trope, which is about as persuasive as the nature versus nurture trope. They're both just wrong constructions. Francis Collins, who, of course, is one of the heroes of genomic science and now the director of the National Institute of Health, is a deeply religious, I guess he would describe himself as a fundamentalist. I mean, a deep, and many, many scientists will describe themselves as deeply religion and science are simply operating on different planes. This is not a dichotomy. That's a false understanding. But in a simplistic sense, people who are deeply religious, in creationism, the most obvious example, there are some people who will pose religious commitment or conviction or biblical inerrancy against science. And when they set it up that way, they will support typically the biblical side. So there's a part of the American population that's mistrustful of science, or at least of science as conventionally understood, lab science and so on. I think that's relatively small. I think it's probably declining. It's not unimportant. Chris Mooney wrote a book called The Republican War on Science as an attack on the Bush administration and its refusal to take seriously what he at least understood to be. So I think there's conflict out there, but I think on balance, the population trusts science and scientists and scientific knowledge more than anything else. With some people who are clearly exceptions. You're not persuaded, but yes.
Hi, I just was thinking about the survey that you reported where the subjects were hopefully to identify with someone who had had their DNA sampled. And I was thinking, as you described it, and I guess most people would call me white at this point in this country, I was surprised that the results for the quote-unquote whites didn't match what I would want. So that got me to start thinking about why not. And just to maybe complicate some of your categories or ask if you've thought about complicating them in further work, it occurs to me that my particular issue is I'm second generation of 100% Eastern European Jewish extraction, and I know that. So I don't need that immediate, yes, she's European. What would be interesting would be, were the ancestors that were Jews in Europe for so long 100% this or that, European, or I saw a study recently, for example, that suggests that there's more Middle Eastern DNA in Eastern European Jews than previously realized. So that would be, but those are long way back things for me and not immediate. So it seems to me the amount of time that maybe you've been in the United States could affect your interest in, I'd be much more interested in the little bit of this and little bit of that than the, yes, you're European, like, well, that's not news. And then the other, just to add to that, is that goes along with a change that we've seen in the rhetoric about race in the United States, and adding there the word ethnicity And in the last 30, 40, 50 years, and certainly the whole rise of multiculturalism within the academy and the shift, let's say, from calling people black to calling them African American, Asians to Asian American, the idea that these are not races, they are ethnicities. And that's something that's arisen partly in the academy, partly in the larger world, to deal with exactly the kind of problem of race that you brought up at the beginning. But the other side of that is that, let's say, people who think of themselves as Irish or German, they can't get that fine level of information out of their DNA samples. So again, they may have a different interest in what they may know they're Irish, so they may be interested, in what, they want something different. So anyways, I wondered if you've thought about ways to complicate those categories in your own research.
Yeah, no, we definitely need to. The problem is that turn what you just said into a question that's available in a public opinion survey for people with education from, second grade, right? So clearly, the survey is just the very bare beginnings. I will report that I did my own DNA ancestry testing very early on, about 5 years ago when it was 5, 6, 7 years ago when it was just starting to be done. And I turned out to have some fraction of Native American ancestry and some fraction of East Asian ancestry, neither of which shows up in my two sides of my family's extensive genealogical knowledge. So my mother said it had been a lot of time trying to figure out where the Native American ancestry came from. My father said, I asked him about the East Asian, and he said, don't believe the test. So, there's lots of kind of responses to these kinds. The short version is that clearly this needs to be much more sophisticated, much more subtle, much more elaborated. For people who are genuinely interested in their ancestry, the kind of question I'm asking is essentially laughable. It just doesn't take you very far. So most people who do these ancestry tests, the DNA tests, have done a lot of genealogical, sort of conventional, paper-based, record-based genealogical research. And then they do much, much more elaborated DNA tests, which actually can be, you can do, 67, 122 markers and get very fine-grained results. If you yourself and your cousin and your aunt and your nephew and your this and that, and you do sort of, so yes, a serious study of the actual use of DNA ancestry testing will produce a much more complex story than anything we can remotely produce in a vignette on a public opinion survey. For our purposes, it was really more the question of kind of, if you think of yourself as being some race, and the test tells you you're some other race, do you believe the test or do you believe yourself? Do you care? Does it matter? How does that pairing vary depending on what race you think you are and what race the test is telling you? We're interested in a sort of a much less fine-grained understanding of ancestry for political purposes. You're talking about the actual genealogical knowledge, which is just a somewhat different enterprise. Yes? No.
I have a question and a comment. The comment is that a few years ago, I was being treated for high blood pressure. And so they couldn't find anything that worked. And they said, well, we're going to try this, that, and that. And they said, we're not going to try particular drugs, ACE inhibitors, because they don't work in black people. And I said, well, they worked in my sister, and lo and behold, they gave it to me and it worked. Does that make me not black? Certainly not. And then the question that I had is that, did you dig deeper to find out what were the reasons behind whites not being pleased about being associated with Europe in particular?
Whoever told you that you shouldn't try ACE inhibitors because they don't work in black people is just a bad mathematician as well as a bad doctor. That's just a stupid comment. What's correct is that there are certain populations that are proportionally more and less likely to respond in particular ways to particular drugs or particular drug dosages. So it's not crazy to start out by looking at any one of us and saying, all right, the first thing I'm going to try is a this rather than a that, because you look European or you look African, and I know probabilistically that that's the best starting point. That's, and the medical people will tell us that that's a perfectly reasonable starting point. But it's a starting point. It's the first step. So, yes, you're right. My advice on that case is change doctors immediately. Don't stop thinking you're black. Do change doctors. So, you know, I mean, it's an issue of probabilities and likelihoods. It's not an issue of black-white, so to speak. The survey, we had a few open-ended. We asked people sort of, why did you give the answers? And we haven't really gotten into those very much, but most people don't bother to respond to that. It didn't give us very much. What we have done is content analyses of media reports of people who have done these kinds of tests. So it's a beginning of an answer to your kind of question. Why do people take these tests? What do they think they're going to get out of them? Are they pleased or displeased? Why do they like or dislike the results? But it turns out, and of course, that's a totally non-representative sample of anything, right? It's people who happen to take the test, whom journalists happen to know, who journalists happen to interview, whom editors happen to accept the quotation for the article. I mean, it's 47 layers of filtering. Whites are doing it, you know, the set of people who give answers. It's a sort of, it's, you know, a multicultural, small world kind of logic. That some fraction of the white population, probably very small, is a little embarrassed about being pure blood white, right? I mean, you know, we're supposed to be citizens of the world, right? And, you know, this isn't, we all know that history of the one drop of blood rule, and we don't want to personify it, right? You know, I'm not one of those Virginians from 1924, you know, so I think that's a kind of, it's a kind of a genuine, I don't mean to make fun of it, I mean, it's a genuine politics that says, this is just an inappropriate kind of person to be in this century with this political and racial configuration in the world. That's the best I can get out of the newspaper stories, but I don't know that I trust them, again, because it's such a filtering process to get those kind of quotes into a story. I was quite surprised by these results. And I've only actually talked about a small fraction of the survey as a whole. We've got other vignettes that kind of will come at this in a slightly different direction. So maybe they'll give us a better handle on what's going on. I'm much less surprised by the black results in some ways. I mean, and Skip Gates articulated it. You know, you don't know what that history was, and it becomes profoundly meaningful to get a sense that I have a real link. So the short answer is I don't really know, except I don't want to use the word political correctness for whites, because I don't think that's fair. I think it's a genuine belief of a desire to abjure that racial history in my own person as well as in my politics. But that's the best I can suggest as a possible answer.
I was just wondering, from a policy perspective, it seems that really the most important issue is the distribution of benefits and or kind of compensation for harms and social harms. And so I think that the threat here, or the felt threat, the perceived threat, is that the biology won't line up with that, or that somehow the biology will be used to take that away or change the distribution. And to me that seems to be, so how this is used in a political context as a basis potentially for distributive or redistributive policies is probably one of the major political implications. And that on the social side you have, if a group is a recipient of harms, then that's going to consolidate the identity and the link to the identity, but that's a social issue really more than a political issue in my mind. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
My main hesitation is that I don't think we actually do distribute benefits or policies by race much anymore. I mean, you know, the affirmative action has largely disappeared as a serious public policy endeavor. Certainly in the public arena, there are pockets in private universities and so on. So it's not, I mean, I don't see any direct one-for-one relationship between racial identity or identification and distribution of public policies. Am I just not thinking of what you have in mind, or what? Say it again? The Indian population, yeah, is that the indigenous Indian population? I just couldn't hear you. That's a very interesting question. And I haven't talked about that because I already had too much in this talk, so I was trying to kind of simplify, believe it or not. Indigenous populations are deeply mistrustful of the DNA ancestry testing in general. A quick generalization, you know, there are exceptions and so on. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One is a philosophical, religious, ethical belief which people will articulate that actually almost the opposite from the mainstream population. The mainstream population, the big anxiety is my DNA is my own, and you criminal justice system or you medical researcher can't have my DNA. It's private, it's mine. My baby's is mine. Privacy, privacy. The indigenous populations, or at least spokespeople, will say, my DNA is not my own. It belongs to the community. I don't have the right to do my own personal ancestry testing because it'll produce information that the rest of my community might not want to have public. And again, I'm simplifying a little bit on both. Actually, I'm not simplifying on the privacy side. So the indigenous populations have a very different view, or at least some spokespeople do. And there is clearly the question of benefits, and yes, and because, you know, given the history of definitions of who counts as an American Indian, you have to have a certain fraction of Indian blood, again, scare quotes around all these terms, in order to be a registered enrolled tribal member, in order to get a whole series of federal benefits and so on. And it turns out that, of course, indigenous populations are very, very, very much intermixed racially and have been for many generations. So lots of people who identify as Indian or want to get those benefits don't actually want the testing because they're not very happy about what the results might show. So there's a sort of a material benefit reason and a more sort of general philosophical argument against. So yeah, so I think the indigenous populations are quite different. And this, roughly what I've described, is true around the world. There was an effort to kind of do ancestry testing of lots of indigenous populations around the world, and it just ran into an absolute roadblock and got stopped for that kind of reason. But I don't think that explains much of the rest of any of what I'm talking about here, because in fact, we had too few Native Americans in our sample to do anything with. I mean, we had 6 people or something like that. So I'm not sure that I've answered your question, really, is it? I'm sorry, can you use the mic?
I'm just interested in the political versus the social, and so how this is going to actually enter the political arena or the policy arena in a debate.
I don't know that the ancestry stuff will, frankly. I mean, that's why I wanted to do the forensic DNA, because that's an obvious policy issue.
Right.
So I see the ancestry stuff as more, I guess, political, very broadly defined. Political really is as much defined as social. But it has to do with, you know, construction of group identity, with who you want to be affiliated with a set of things that will bleed into political discourse or political decision-making. I don't think the ancestry testing is itself a policy issue. I think the forensic biobank, I mean, the use in the criminal justice system is obviously a policy issue. Okay. You'll notice that's why the title of my talk was Politics and Policies, because I knew that the ancestry stuff didn't have much to do with policies.
Maybe just one more question?
Thank you. This is a very fascinating presentation. The effort to anticipate policy areas that will be on the agenda and where the tensions would be when they arise. To help a little bit with understanding where you are on this, I have 2 questions that have to do with the survey results, the attitudes by race. One is, do you have any data from elsewhere or in your own work that looks at attitudes as it relates to use of DNA testing or genomics in other areas, for example, in healthcare? You know, do you get something that's race-based sickle cell or hypertension, things that are considered to have racial, and are the attitudes any different there as opposed to the criminal justice orientation? Then the second is, within the criminal justice orientation, do you have anything in your identification of the people you've visited that indicates class, that indicates social or economic background in addition to or as opposed to race as possibly an explanatory factor? Thank you.
The answer to the first question is yes. The criminal justice data come out of a survey that we designed. It's a 20, 25-minute survey So we've got like 6 or 8 questions about criminal justice, but we've got a whole slew of other questions about use in the health. We've got ancestry questions, test questions, we've got healthcare, and we just haven't analyzed those. We just got the results a few weeks ago. So let's talk. 6 months or a year from now, I'll be able to answer that. In regard to the criminal justice stuff, yes, we've got kind of standard demographics. And we have some, again, because this was done by knowledge networks and we had access to whatever they provided us, there aren't as good political and ideological questions as I would like. I'm trying to remember, I've got the results here, which I can find afterwards if we want to talk. There are a bunch of small, statistically significant correlations and substantively pretty meaningless. It's interesting. Women tend to be more pleased, more influenced, and more likely to believe than men do. People with high education believe it more but are less pleased. I mean, it's a hodgepodge of small results. You know, they're real. I mean, they aren't, I think, purely random. But the biggest thing that comes through is that that the race is actually the strongest explanatory factor in relationship to gender, class, education. Ideology doesn't matter. Political identification doesn't matter. Religiosity doesn't matter. Whether you work inside the home, whether you work with technology, all those things basically don't seem to make any difference. This is a pretty noisy process. Race seems to be the one thing that actually shows some systematic pattern, which is what I was pointing out. I think that'll change. I think as this becomes more publicly visible and more publicly known, there will be a set of class implications and so on. But at the moment, it's mostly noise. I can show you the specific results afterwards.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.